Have you ever wondered, are all angels truly perfect? Or were there once angels, beings of light, sent down from heaven to protect mankind, who were the first to betray God? In ancient times, there was a group of angels known as the Watchers. They stood between heaven and earth, witnessing every breath of humanity. But instead of guarding, they chose to break the boundary, chose to love humans, and in doing so, committed an unforgivable sin. This isn't just a story of a fall from grace. It is a story of desire, of their hybrid offspring, the Nephilim, and of a transgression so grave that God unleashed the great flood to erase mankind. In this video, we step into one of the most hidden mysteries of the Bible, a tale long forbidden, long forgotten, yet still whispered through the centuries. Join me as we uncover the secrets the Bible never wanted you to know. Right now. Imagine traveling back to the earliest days of humankind, when the earth was still wild, untouched by war or greed. This was the pre-flood era, a mysterious time only briefly mentioned in the canonical Bible. In that primordial age, humanity began to multiply across the earth. And in his divine wisdom, God sent a special group of angels down to earth. They were called the Watchers, or in ancient Hebrew, Irim, the ones who stay awake. Their role wasn't to fight, but rather to observe, protect, and guide mankind to live in righteousness. But their story isn't found in the traditional Bible. Instead, it's hidden in ancient texts that were removed or never canonized, such as the Book of Enoch, the Book of Jubilees, and the Dead Sea Scrolls. These writings paint a vivid image of celestial beings who walked among mortals. At first, the Watchers remained passive, true to their name. But the more time they spent among humans, especially human women, the more tempted they became. Their once pure hearts began to stir with fleshly desire, something strictly forbidden by heavenly law. And then, a fateful decision was made. Led by the angel Samayosa, 200 Watchers gathered and made a solemn vow on Mount Hermon, that they would all commit the transgression together, so none would bear the punishment alone. This was the beginning of one of the greatest betrayals in sacred history. Soon after, they took human wives, and from these unions came the Nephilim, giant offspring with immense strength and destructive appetites. At the same time, the Watchers began to teach mankind forbidden knowledge, how to forge weapons, use cosmetics, practice sorcery, and unlock mysteries meant only for the divine. The story of the Watchers is a disruptive thread in theological history, where angels no longer symbolize pure obedience, but instead become the origin of chaos and divine wrath. When the light of heaven still touched the earth in the dawn of creation, a group of angels were sent down to humanity with a sacred mission to observe and guide mankind. They were known as the Watchers. They were forbidden to interfere, to love, or to cross the boundary between the divine and the mortal. And yet, in the silence of early earth, where humanity slowly bloomed and life began to take form, a forbidden desire began to stir in the hearts of these celestial beings. Among the 200 Watchers sent to earth, one stood out above the rest, Samayosa, a mighty and wise leader. But it was Samayosa who first felt his spirit waver. He beheld the beauty of human women, a beauty unknown in heaven. And in his heart awakened a feeling he had never known before, desire. Samayosa hesitated. He knew it was wrong. But more than guilt, what he feared most was being punished alone if he acted first. So he gathered all 200 angels. Upon Mount Hermon, under the pale light of an ancient moon, they joined hands and made a binding oath. Samayosa declared, "If I do this alone, I will be destroyed. But if we all do it together, none of us will be abandoned." And they agreed. They swore to commit the sin together, to abandon the law of heaven and to choose humankind, even at the cost of losing eternity, glory, and salvation. After that oath, the Watchers began taking human wives. They lived among humans like gods who had descended from the stars. But the result of these unions was not peace or love, it was the birth of terrifying beings known as Nephilim. The Nephilim were the fusion of the sacred and the profane. They were unlike any creature the world had ever seen. Towering over mountains, their strength could crush stone, their intelligence rivaled sages, but their nature was cruel, violent, and greedy. At first, they consumed all the food produced by humans. When that ran out, they ate animals. And then, they began eating humans. The earth descended into chaos. Human society was thrown into terror. Villages were destroyed. Tribes became enslaved. But the worst was yet to come. The fallen angels went even further. They taught humans forbidden knowledge, secrets meant only for the divine. The most infamous among them was Azazel, one of the most powerful of the Watchers. He taught mankind to forge weapons and armor, sparking the first wars in human history. He taught women how to use cosmetics, dye their hair, dress seductively, spreading lust and corruption. And worst of all, he shared magic, astrology, and dark arts, opening a gateway for evil spirits to seep into the world. The world was no longer the pure creation of God, it became a realm of blood, desire, and ruin. The Watchers, once guardians, had become agents of chaos. When humanity's cries of suffering reached the heavens, God heard. But he did not unleash wrath immediately. First, he sent his faithful angels to investigate. And when the truth was revealed, he passed judgment. 3 archangels were sent, Michael, Raphael, and Gabriel. Each had a divine task. Michael led the charge to slay the Nephilim, striking down the monstrous offspring without mercy. Gabriel purified the earth, destroying the unholy unions. And Raphael, the angel of healing, was now given the opposite role, to bind Azazel, cast him into the darkness, and bury him beneath the earth until Judgment Day. As for Samyaza, he was suspended between heaven and earth, hanging in limbo, belonging to neither realm, a living symbol of divine betrayal and cursed rebellion. But God knew punishing the Watchers alone was not enough. The earth was too corrupted. And so, he decreed a cataclysm, an event that would cleanse the world. Thus came the Great Flood, not just to punish mankind, but to erase the legacy of angelic rebellion. The flood wiped away all traces of Nephilim, the children of forbidden lust, and the blood-stained knowledge passed down by the Watchers. It was heaven's way of pressing the reset button on creation, of silencing the corruption and restoring the divine order. This entire story does not appear in the traditional Bible, but it is recorded in an ancient text known as the Book of Enoch, specifically its first section, the Book of the Watchers. In this text, we find the full account, the oath of Samyaza, the rise of the Nephilim, the corruption spread by Azazel, the intervention of the archangels, and God's final judgment through the flood. The book even speaks of a coming day of judgment, when the Watchers will again be called to answer for their crimes. However, the Book of Enoch was excluded from the official Bible by the early church around the 4th century. The reason? It was too mystical, too complex, and threatened the image of angels as pure, obedient beings. Though banned, the book survived in ancient Ethiopian texts, and much later, was rediscovered in the Dead Sea Scrolls in the 20th century. Because of that, the story of the Watchers, the angels who fell, was brought once again into the light, after thousands of years buried in silence. After hearing the epic tale of the Watcher's betrayal, one question continues to echo in our minds: why would divine beings, created from light, assigned to protect humanity, turn against the very God who created them? The answer is far from simple. This is not just a story about desire or weakness. Beneath their fall lies a deep web of spiritual contradictions, symbolic meanings, and ancient theories that have lasted for millennia. One of the most common explanations for the Watcher's fall is lust, specifically, the irresistible allure of human women. This motive is clearly stated in the Book of Enoch and is the primary trigger for the oath on Mount Hermon. But many modern theologians argue that lust was only the surface. The deeper cause lies in something more profound: free will. In both Jewish and Christian theology, there's a notion that even angels possess the ability to choose. God's decision to place the Watchers among humans, an imperfect species, was perhaps a divine test. One they failed. This opens a philosophical dilemma: can true perfection exist if it does not allow the choice to do wrong? It's easy to see why the story of the Watchers became problematic for Orthodox theology. Angels, once seen as pure, obedient messengers, are shown to sin, rebel, and even corrupt humanity. The existence of Nephilim, half-divine hybrids, blurs the line between God and man. Azazel teaching mankind how to make weapons may be misinterpreted as a condemnation of civilization itself. Early church fathers, like Augustine and Jerome, debated fiercely over whether the Book of Enoch should be canonized. Ultimately, due to its mystical, unverifiable, and potentially misleading content, it was excluded from the Bible, despite being held in high regard by early Jewish and Christian communities. And so, the story of the Watchers became a buried secret, surviving only through scattered manuscripts and whispered legend. A compelling theory from comparative mythology suggests that the Watchers are not just literal angels, but rather an archetype found in many ancient cultures, divine beings who bring forbidden knowledge to humans and are punished for it. We see this pattern across mythologies. Prometheus in Greek myth steals fire, symbol of knowledge, from the gods and gives it to humans, and is chained and tortured for eternity. Quetzalcoatl in Mesoamerican lore, a feathered god who teaches agriculture, astronomy, and writing. Thoth in Egyptian mythology, god of wisdom and magic who mediates between gods and mankind. Viewed this way, the Watchers are the biblical Prometheus, bringers of light who paid a divine price for crossing the line. What Azazel and the other Watchers taught, metalworking, cosmetics, astrology, weren't inherently evil. Weapons can defend. Beauty isn't sin. Astrology evolved into astronomy. So perhaps the knowledge itself wasn't the problem. Perhaps the sin was in giving it to humanity too soon, before we were morally ready. This aligns with the story of Adam and Eve eating from the tree of knowledge, not because the fruit was poisonous, but because they were not ready to comprehend evil. In this light, Azazel isn't just a villain. He's a tragic figure, one who brought light but was burned by it. Outside of religious interpretation, the ancient astronaut theory offers a radical perspective, that the Watchers weren't angels at all, but extraterrestrial beings mistaken for divine messengers. Supporters of this theory point to descriptions of Watchers descending from the sky with radiant appearances and powers. The rapid advancement of human knowledge after their arrival, metalworking, astronomy, cosmetics. The global prevalence of myths about half-human, half-divine beings. While not accepted by mainstream science, this theory has captivated popular imagination and suggests that our ancient ancestors may have interpreted advanced beings through the only lens they had, that of the divine. Stepping away from speculation, the Watcher's tale can also be read as a timeless spiritual warning about crossing forbidden lines, about the consequences of knowledge without wisdom, and about the peril of human pride. In today's world, where humanity wields the power of AI, gene editing, and quantum science, this message is hauntingly relevant. Like the Watchers, we stand on the edge of discovery and danger. Are we ready for the knowledge we are creating? Or are we, too, reaching beyond what we're meant to touch? Finally, let us not view the Watchers only as traitors. Unlike Lucifer, who rebelled out of pride and envy, the Watchers did not seek to replace God. They simply wanted to love. They loved humanity. They longed to experience life, beauty, and physical connection. And in that desire, they broke the law, but not in hatred, only in longing. That's why they weren't annihilated. They were imprisoned, trapped between heaven and earth, entombed in the shadows, not as destroyers, but as eternal reminders of what happens when divine beings fall in love with the mortal. The story of the Watchers did not end as a forgotten chapter of ancient myth. Even though it was removed from the official Bible and concealed for centuries, its traces remain, not only in ancient manuscripts but also in the collective consciousness of humanity. From the earliest times, the tale of the fallen angels and their giant offspring, the Nephilim, resonated across cultures. In Jewish literature, despite strict theological control, scholars and mystics have quietly acknowledged the Watchers as an essential part of humanity's metaphysical history. In Ethiopia, the Book of Enoch is still preserved as sacred scripture within the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church. There, it is treated as a reliable source of angelic history. The rediscovery of this book among the Dead Sea Scrolls in 1947 reignited worldwide scholarly interest and public fascination. In popular culture, from the 20th century onward, the Watchers began to reappear in films, novels, video games, and modern conspiracy theories. In the movie Noah, 2014, the Watchers are portrayed as massive stone giants, exiled angels seeking redemption. Though fictionalized, their inclusion reflects a growing hunger to revisit the buried stories of the Bible. Within theological discourse, the Watchers have sparked deep debates about the nature of angels, sin, and free will. If angels can fall, does it challenge the concept of divine perfection? If forbidden knowledge leads to destruction, can humanity ever truly be ready to receive the light? In the realm of mysticism and esotericism, the Watchers remain figures of mystery and intrigue. Some believe that descendants of the Nephilim still walk the earth today, hidden among elites or powerful figures in modern society. While such theories lack empirical evidence, they continue to captivate the imagination, especially in times of global uncertainty. Ultimately, the Watchers are more than forgotten angels. They are mirrors of humanity's own struggles with temptation, pride, and forbidden ambition. Their fall is not just a tale of divine punishment, it's a symbolic lesson about boundaries, responsibility, and the price of unchecked desire. They represent the deepest human fear and fascination: what happens when sacred beings fall in love with the mortal? When divine messengers disobey their creator, not out of hatred, but out of longing, curiosity, or compassion. That is why their story, though buried for thousands of years, has never truly disappeared. It survives in whispers, resurfacing again and again in culture, theology, and myth. The Watchers may have been cast into darkness, but their legacy continues to shine in the questions they left behind. In a world shaped by science, technology, and information, one might expect ancient stories about angels, betrayal, and giants to fade into myth. And yet, the tale of the Watchers, the fallen angels, continues to capture hearts and minds in the 21st century. Why? What gives a forbidden narrative, buried for thousands of years, such enduring power in the modern age? One of the clearest reasons is humanity's deep fascination with what has been forbidden, censored, or concealed. In a time when we are drowning in information yet constantly questioning what is real, stories like the Book of Enoch or the legend of the Nephilim are seen as symbols of a lost knowledge, secrets that might change everything we think we know. The rise of religious conspiracy theories, alternative history movements, and a hunger for hidden scriptures have inspired a new generation to rediscover the stories they believe were deliberately erased. The story of the Watchers also acts as a mirror for the fears and dilemmas of our time, the abuse of power, knowledge that outpaces morality, and humanity playing God through machines and biology. Today, we're creating artificial intelligence that may outthink us, gene-editing tools that rewrite life itself, and weapons capable of ending civilizations. All of this echoes the Watcher's tale, powerful beings bestowing knowledge upon a world not yet ready for it. Are we repeating their mistake? In film, games, and literature, the Watchers and Nephilim have become a powerful narrative archetype. In Noah, 2014, the Watchers are reimagined as giant stone beings with tragic pasts. In video games like Assassin's Creed and Devil May Cry, the fallen angel or hybrid god-human trope creates rich narratives about conflict, freedom, and destiny. In manga and fantasy novels, Nephilim often symbolize the burden of great power and the pain of not belonging, caught between two worlds. These figures are more than characters. They are symbols of identity struggle, of choosing between loyalty and love, and of bearing divine potential within fragile human form. Beyond action and mythology, the Watcher's story stirs profound questions. Can knowledge be sinful if it arrives too soon? Can compassion and love justify sacred rebellion? Can something divine still fall and still be worth redeeming? These are not outdated questions. They are eternal human dilemmas present in every religion, philosophy, and moral system. Unlike Lucifer, who rebelled out of envy and ambition, the Watchers did not seek to overthrow God. They fell because they longed to love, to experience the beauty of human life. They broke the rules not from hate, but from yearning. This creates a gray area. They are neither demons nor saints. And that grayness makes their story feel deeply human, a tragic echo of every person who's ever crossed a line in pursuit of something greater. Modern audiences, surrounded by complexity and contradiction, find truth in this ambiguity. We ask ourselves, did they fall out of sin or out of love? The story of the Watchers lives on because it dwells at the intersection of myth and science, faith and rebellion, divine and human. It reminds us of how fragile the boundaries truly are and how easily they can be crossed. In a world obsessed with breaking limits, chasing forbidden ideas, and unlocking divine-level powers, the Watchers are not ancient villains, but eternal warnings. They are the sacred echo of a question still haunting us. What happens when we reach for knowledge too great for us to hold? The story of the Watchers is not merely an ancient myth. It's a mirror reflecting eternal human questions, free will, the limits of knowledge, forbidden desire, and the consequences of crossing the sacred line between heaven and earth. Together, we've journeyed through a strange and powerful tale, from the oath on Mount Hermon to the birth of the Nephilim, from God's judgment and the Great Flood to modern theories that shake the foundations of theology. And in the end, we see that this story doesn't belong to the past. It's quietly alive in every boundary we test today. So what do you think? Were the watchers traitors or tragic beings burdened by sacred longing? Does the pursuit of knowledge always carry a price? And is the line between angel and human thinner than we ever imagined? If this story stirred something in you, if it made you wonder, reflect, or look at faith with new eyes, then share this video, leave a comment, and subscribe to join me in uncovering more of the hidden truths, the stories the Bible never wanted you to know. Thank you for being part of this journey. And remember, some truths are never truly lost, only waiting to be revealed.